Welcome to tonight's live stream presentation by peace activist Noor Ghazi. I'm your host, Lisa Loving, and you might know me from my KBOO show called Keeping It Real every Thursday morning at 8. Tonight's event has been coordinated by the PeaceandJusticeWorks Iraq Affinity Group. PeaceandJusticeWorks has been promoting nonviolent conflict resolution on local, national, and international levels since 1992 in Portland. The PeaceandJusticeWorks Iraq Affinity Group has been educating the public about the effects of U.S. policy on the people of Iraq and other areas, including Southwest Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East, and on the domestic costs of war. Starting in March 2020, the Iraq Affinity Group took over sponsorship of the weekly Friday Rally for Peace and Justice at Pioneer Courthouse Square, an event that's been ongoing since 2001. If you have questions for our speaker tonight, you can send them in to feedback@pjw.info. That's feedback@pjw.info. And we'll read them in during the Q&A period. Tonight's talk is titled, The U.S. Invasion of Iraq, Intended or Unintended Consequences. We also want to thank the co-sponsors of today's event, Peace Action Group at First Unitarian, War Resisters League Portland, and Alliance for Democracy. The event is also endorsed by the Oregon Progressive Party and is funded in part by the Iraq Affinity Group's Ruth Hold Memorial Fund for Peace Journeys. I'll be introducing our guest in just a minute, but I've got two more quick announcements. For the people who are watching this live tonight on YouTube, we'll be holding an after event with the cast and crew, so you can talk in person with me and Noor Ghazi and behind the scenes folks running this show. The short URL for that Zoom call is tinyurl.com/Ghazi after. It's tinyurl.com/Ghazi after. We'll put this up on the screen again before the Q&A and at the end as well. If you run into any technical issues tonight, you should text Peace and Justice Works at 503-236-3065, and they'll see what they can do to help. That's 503-236-3065. Okay, so now let's put some context on tonight's talk. You'll hear from Noor Ghazi that she lived in Iraq under sanctions and war. The United States continues to have a presence in Iraq, including 2,500 troops and the world's largest embassy. Iraq sits right next to Iran, putting it quite literally in the middle of the tensions that erupted in May when the Israeli military killed an Iranian diplomat in Syria and missiles flew in both directions over Iraq's territory. Many people seem to forget that when the U.S. launched the so-called Gulf War in 1991, it was our first major operation after the fall of the Berlin Wall, meaning it was the first major post-Cold War shooting war. But people also seem to forget that U.S. interference with Iraq has stretched throughout that time, from the imposition of sanctions in August 1990 to today. We're very pleased to have Noor Ghazi here to give a first-hand account of what life has been like for the people of Iraq and to bring her special perspective as a proponent of peace. Ms. Ghazi holds an MA in Peace and Conflict Studies with a focus on international peace development. She serves as director of the university sponsorship program at Guilford College, with every campus a refuge, ICAR. Her involvement as a professor of practice at UNC Chapel Hill, US, and a visiting lecturer at Mosul University, Iraq, allows her to dedicate time to peace projects, including a documentary highlighting life under ISIS in Mosul called The Mother of Two Springs. She also produced a short documentary about peace building in Mosul, Peace Letters to Nineveh, with a strong emphasis on conflict in Iraq's modern history. Ms. Ghazi actively fosters collaborative efforts for peace building by creating inclusive platforms that unite diverse voices towards a more peaceful future in the region. Welcome, Noor. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for an incredible introduction and a little bit of context and background about today's talk. So thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone to speak about my experience and firsthand experience in Iraq. And I usually would like to say by identifying myself as my name is Noor Ghazi and I am a refugee from Iraq. So I'll be talking about my journey and starting to shed light on some of the events that unfolded in Iraq during the 90s and up to 2003, and then the chaotic civil war that started or erupted after that. So I was born and raised in Baghdad, Iraq. And as a child, I remember my very first core memory that I have it up to this day is that I was in war, during war, and it was dark, and I was running towards my mom, looking for safety. So this was my very, very first core memory as a child in Iraq. And that was during the 1991, during the bombing campaign that was led by the US on Iraq, after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, when the ex-Iraqi president Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990. And then growing up really just under that time of Saddam's regime, the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. And not only that, it's just like that was not enough, but also living during the economic sanctions that were imposed on Iraq after the Kuwait invasion. So as you see here on the screen, a picture of me and my siblings at that time. So on the left, picture of me and my little brother. And then on the right, a picture from the right to the left, me in the middle, my brother, and then on the left, my older sister. So during that time, I don't think this was an easy time for all Iraqis when reflecting and recalling memories and the time we lived under the economic sanctions and under Saddam's regime. As a child and during that time, I've always heard the conversation that the economic sanctions, and that term in Arabic calls hisar. So always adults will be speaking about the hisar will be lifted on Iraq. So the economic sanctions will be lifted from Iraq. And I tried as a little child to put that word hisar into something visual where I can understand what does hisar mean. And then I'm going to school. I mean, of course, the schools were in a dire situation, so we barely have a desk to sit on, and in one desk they fit 5 to 6 students on one desk. Having one pencil, me and my siblings to do our homework. And we made sure that we're not going to sharpen that pencil more often just because my parents cannot afford another one. I remember every night before going to school in the morning, me and my siblings would have this conversation on Who should have the pencil on the first, on the first period, who of the classroom, who should have the pencil second. And then I would always argue, I have a math class, can I have the pencil because I need to take notes? And then, we would really just have to survive off of 1 or 2 meals a day, just because this was the reality of millions of children who lived in Iraq. I remember I used to complain about the date syrup sandwich that my mom would make us to school sometimes. And I would say, why do we eat this date syrup sandwich every day to school? And then I was either in first or second grade when I was sitting about to eat my date syrup sandwich, complaining as usual. And then I saw those little two kids, a brother and a sister, who, in their weary book bag, the little sister, she tried to pick a little bit of crumbs from the bottom of the pocket in her book bag, and then she found a little bit and she put it in her brother's mouth. I still remember the happiness on her face. She could not find any more crumbs for her. So this was the reality of the children. At that moment, I felt thankful that I have that date syrup sandwich. But I wondered, is this the reality of millions of children around the world? Or is this only in Iraq? And I think that was a turning moment for me as a child, that I want to do something so I won't have to see children not having food when they go to school. And again, this was just the reality of our world at that time in Iraq, despite the fact that we're talking about like healthcare services. I barely remember going to a doctor unless it was like something emergency. I barely remember visiting a dentist unless they had to take out my tooth. So this was our reality. The death of 500,000 children in Iraq, which this topic was debatable. Some would say it was the propaganda of Saddam Hussein to use against the US, and some would say it was the reality of our world at that time in Iraq due to malnutrition. For me, I would say, could the number be fake? It could be, yes. But was this the reality of our time in Iraq? Yes. Were children dying from malnutrition, from the lack of medical equipment? Yes. Despite the fact that many of my classmates who have lost their fathers during the war with Iran, which lasted from 1980 to 1988, or Kuwait invasion, or the highway of death, that also caused the death of thousands of Iraqi military personnel. And I still remember going to school, my parents would tell me not to talk about my father, not to mention my father, just simply because many of my classmates don't have fathers. So this was the reality of our world as Iraqis at that time. But I've always heard the word hisar. The hisar will be lifted on Iraq. So I one day had a conversation with my grandfather, and I say, can you explain to me, what does it mean the hisar will be lifted? And he simply put it in a way where I could understand it. And he explained that when the hisar is lifted, I'll be able to have as many pencils as I wanted. I'll be able to have a new book bag. I'll be able to have a better school. And he put it in a context for me that as a child, I understood that when hisar is lifted from Iraq or on Iraq, I will just have a better life as a child. And then I remember one day I was walking in the market with my father, and I smelled the banana, which I never had before. Like, I never tasted it. And it smelled so good. And I asked my father if he could buy me one. I said, well, what does this call? And he said, it is called banana. And I said, well, it smells too good. Can you buy me one? And I remember how Hisar, or how the economic sanctions, forced my father to lie to me because he simply could not afford buying me a banana. And he said, this is fake. It's not real banana. And I said, but it smells so good to be fake. And he said, but look, it has a sticker. It's fake. I promise one day I'll buy you banana. So these are just like little things that sometimes when we think about places around the world with conflicts and war zone, we tend to not see and zoom in to see the suffer of children's things that we don't think it's important to think about. Part of that, for example, the long hours where we did not simply have electricity, with the very scorching sun of Baghdad. Like right now, it's 120 degrees in Baghdad. And I remember every single day I go to school and I'm just sleep deprived, just simply because the power would go off around 12 a.m. exactly. And we have to stay up until 12 a.m. And then 12 a.m. we would go on the rooftop. And then we would put our mattresses and then we go to sleep. And by then it's around 1:30 a.m. So that's when we go to sleep every single day, despite, that we have school next morning, just because we don't have electricity and it's very, very hot. We wake up around 6:30 to go to school. And I do not remember a day that I went to school without really just falling asleep in my classroom. Sometimes we have research that talk about the importance of sleep and what does it do to children and how careful we should be. And I just reflect on my own journey. When was the last time as a child that I just had a good night's sleep, and I went to school fresh? So these are the little things that we sometimes don't think about. And then the conversation started to happen about the US, whether we call it invasion or liberation or occupation or the military operations. I'm not here to label the 2003 military operations in Iraq. I will leave it to the audience to decide. I guess whatever I'm going to label it, if I label it whatever I label it, it's not going to change the reality of what Iraqis lived in Iraq and they're still living up to this day. So we have facts that we can lay out, and I leave it up to you to decide. When we're looking at the 2003 invasion, as you see in the pictures here, the one on the left, the picture on the left side, I think this is the picture all Iraqis, I believe, remember from the 2003, when Baghdad was being bombarded heavily in 2003. And then on the right side is the fall of the statue of Saddam Hussein, which really symbolized the fall of Baghdad or the fall of the Ba'ath regime. For me, I was 14 years old at that time, and my world and reality revolved about my school, my friends, my safety and my family's safety. So it seems like with every war, Iraqis, and in particular women, they became very prepared when it comes to wars. They know what to prepare, and they know what kind of things that they need to do. So the first thing we have, in almost every Iraqi house, they have this China cabinet that has all of like the glasses in it. So they would have to empty everything out, because if a missile would hit by, that's the first thing that will break and it might hurt people in the house. A next thing would be to cover the windows with blankets. First to cover them with tapes and then with the blanket. So if a missile hit by, the shatter of the window is not going to hurt people in the house. They would store water, a lot of water. They would store food that they know it would last longer, like rice, pasta, potato. Avoid things that would go bad easily, like eggs and vegetables, and especially we expect that the power would go off for a long time. We stack up on gasoline to start up like a generator and to light up candles and stuff like that. So women became very, very experienced during wartime because that was not the first war. Starting from the 1980s, during the Iran war, during the Kuwait invasion, and during the economic sanctions, like they've experienced it all. So for me, I was still like, I would consider myself a child, 14 years old. All I was thinking about is imagining life after 2003. I personally imagine those tall buildings, new Iraq, just new Iraq. I mean, I was born and I grew up under Saddam's regime, and all I learned about was the Ba'ath Party, was the President Saddam, which we called him as children Baba Saddam, Father Saddam. His pictures, Saddam's pictures, were everywhere on the first page of every book that we read at school, in our curriculum. His pictures would center every classroom you enter in our school. His picture would be at the entry of every school. So for me, Saddam was this invincible man that it's impossible to get rid of Saddam, right? And then adults would be afraid to have this conversation in front of kids. So they would not say anything, just afraid that if one of us would say anything outside, then the entire family is in trouble. So adults would refrain from sharing their opinions in front of us. And I guess that was just left to our imagination to think whether Saddam's bad, Baba Saddam's bad, or is he a good man? Is he really going to be overthrown by the US-led coalition? And I think I was just thinking about, if this is going to be the reality and Saddam would be gone, Baba Saddam will be gone, who's going to replace this empty frame in my classroom? Who's going to replace all of these pictures and statues of Saddam Hussein? I mean, I'm at the age of 14 at that time, and Saddam Hussein was the only reality that I know, or that I've known. When the war started, as Iraqis and as a child myself, I never thought it will start. I've always thought that last minute something will happen. They would maybe have a negotiation with Saddam Hussein and the war will stop. It will not happen. Because there are all of these other things that were related to 2003 war, including the WMD, the weapons of mass destruction, right? That is why the US is invading Iraq. And if the US is right that Saddam Hussein is having the weapons of mass destruction, the street talks in Iraq at that time that Saddam was going to use weapons of mass destructions on his own people as well as during the war. So if Saddam was going to use weapons of mass destruction, then, I mean, we will also be impacted, his own people. I guess adults, they had their own worries, and children, they had their own worries. And early mornings, 2003, March, I remember my grandfather opened the bedroom's door and he said, "Get up." The war had officially started. I still did not believe it at that moment that the war started. And the first couple of days, we have not heard a lot of missiles. It was the areas and the provinces around Baghdad were being hit, and the fights were happening around those areas. But then in a couple of days, that's when we started hearing the missiles in Baghdad. That's when we were watching the news. The Iraqi news channels were showing something other than what is the international channels were showing. So the Iraqi national TV was showing that the Iraqi military is still in control. The Iraqi military is slaughtering the US-led coalition as they're trying to enter Baghdad. However, the international news were coming in different direction, talking about the progress that the US-led coalition were making in Iraq and going towards Baghdad. And then the airport battle happened between the Iraqi military and the US-led coalition. And that was close by our house. And then the news were coming that Saddam Hussein was going to use the weapons of mass destruction at the airport. And literally just during this entire process, Iraqis are waiting when Saddam is going to use the weapon of mass destruction. And that's just adding another level of anxiety to this war because a lot of people will die. Interesting enough, one Iraqi scholar wrote in one of his books that were written in Arabic that Saddam Hussein actually used flour during the airport battle in Baghdad to trick the US-led coalition that he actually used weapons of mass destruction. I'm not sure to which extent this is true. I have not read this piece of information within English resource, but I've read it in Arabic by an Iraqi writer. All that to say that the fall of Baghdad became a reality once we have seen that picture on TV. People started to express their opinion, but people were in dilemma. They were happy that Saddam Hussein was gone and the regime was overthrown. But on the other hand, how do they accept this idea of an invader to Iraq? And then for me, I was just wondering about what is the next step? When am I going to go to school and just see my friends? Are they okay? How many people were killed? Just like wondering about all of these information. And I think in 2003, two of the coalition provisional authority most notable decrees entered into force early on. That was in May of 2003. The order number 1, which banned the Ba'ath Party in all forms, which also known as the de-Baathification. And then the order number 2, which dismantled the Iraqi army. Later on, some scholars, they blamed it for fueling the insurgency in Iraq. And they also said that this what led the country into a chaos up to this day. Because, and in particular, the second order, which dismantling the Iraqi army, sending armed military trained men home, that would fuel the insurgency later on and fueled also the civil war that erupted in Iraq in 2006, which is another topic we will touch on. Personally, for me in 2003, and I think one of the highlights that I would like to mention here, again, to just give the audience the perspective of many Iraqis who have been in my position, who have lost loved ones. That was back in 2004 when we were leaving school, me and my friends, And I still remember my friend when I said goodbye to her. We were joking at the school's gate, talking about tomorrow's homework. How are we going to study for history? And when are we going to do our homework? As she walked toward the main street, towards the highway to go to her house, I was walking towards the inner streets to go to my house. That's when I've heard a big explosion. That is when the convoy of the US-led coalition was targeted right in front of our school. And as a moment of chaos, the military personnel, they opened fire. And all I saw is that my best friend fell to ground. And then later she was picked up by a guy who was just driving by the street. He took her to the hospital. And I did not know what happened to her. I went home, I was nervous. And then the next day I went to school and I heard that she died. So I think death became the norm in Iraq. 1 minute you're standing by someone that you love, the next minute you lose them. And trauma became just part of our normal life every day. I go back home. My mom asked, "What's wrong?" "My friend died." "Sorry to hear that. Do you want to eat?" "Yeah, I want to eat." We don't talk about these stories because we are anxious waiting to hear who's next. It could be me, could be my father, could be my brother or my sister or our neighbor or my uncle. We're going, every time the phone rings, we expect to hear the death of someone. Every time we leave home, we literally say our last goodbyes because we might not make it back home. And that's the norm in Iraq. And especially during 2006, that's when the civil war erupted between the Shia and the Sunni. So as one day I went to school in 2005, a friend of mine asked me if I was a Shia or Sunni. And to me, these two terms were not part of my dictionary. I just did not understand what they meant. And I asked, what do you mean? What are these terms mean? And she said, "Well, what is your last name?" And I gave her my last name and she was like, "Well, you better go ask your parents and understand if you're Shia or Sunni because you will be asked." And that's when I went back home and I asked my dad. I said, "Dad, everybody's talking in school about like Shia and Sunni, but like I don't understand. What does that mean? And what is our last name? Like, what does our last name belongs to? Is it Shia or the Sunni?" And my dad explained that he is Sunni and my mom is Shia. So, and he explained the context behind the Shia and the Sunni. And I asked him, like, is there like a huge difference in practice? Why I have not seen you or my mom practice anything differently? And he explained that we're both Muslim. We both believe in the same God. And we both pray. We both believe in the same book. So those little differences doesn't matter. And he reassured me that that should not be a problem moving on in our life, right? But in 2006, when the civil war erupted in Iraq between the Shia and the Sunni, this conversation became very, very important. You need to be educated and you need to educate your kids about it, because if they were stopped by a checkpoint and they were asked a simple question of what is your last name, and we have given the wrong answer, you will be executed on the scene. And despite all the chaos that was happening in Iraq, my father said, "We're not leaving Iraq. We might die here, yes, but we're not leaving Iraq." That was not until 2006, November. That was November 3rd of 2006, my father received a phone call that his cousin was found drilled to death, naked, and throwing on the trash in Baghdad street. They contacted my father to go pick him up. My father went to pick him up, and he found out that his cousin's body was full of explosive material. So when my father get close to him, it would also target him. And eventually the police picked up the dead body and took it to the hospital. And they asked my father to go do the paperwork and pick him up from the hospital. When my father went to the hospital to pick him up and do the proper paperwork, the way it was done at that time, because the hospital was receiving many, what they call them an unidentified dead bodies. And they're unidentified because after they torture them to death, they would strike them from their IDs. So the way it was done, that every unidentified dead body come to the hospital, they would take a picture of the body and put it away in the morgue. So when the family come to look for their loved ones, they would have to look at the pictures one after another until they be able to identify their loved ones. So my father sat down and he was going through the pictures until he got to his cousin's picture. Only on that day, his cousin's picture or number was 167. So he literally sat down and he had to watch 166 image of people who were brutally murdered to death until he was able to identify his cousin. And after he did, the militia group were waiting for my father at the hospital's door to target him. So eventually my dad said, I can't identify him, and he left. We did not give him the proper burial just because if we attempt to do, then we would have lost my father as well. So when my father came back home, he said, pack your stuff, we're leaving tomorrow morning. And we said, but you said we're never leaving Iraq. He said, no. The way I've seen monsters in Baghdad killing people and killing each other, this cannot be human. How can I imagine that one of my kids be killed and tortured to death in this brutal way? I imagine my cousin begged for his life because he has 7 children waiting back home for him. So he said, pack your stuff, we're leaving. And I remember the last day I attended school, as my school was getting empty little by little. My friends were leaving. A lot of them were leaving out of the country. My other friend, her brother was kidnapped as well. So this just became the norm. You wake up in the morning, you don't know if you will survive that day. So on November 5th, we meant to leave Iraq, and that's when Saddam Hussein was sentenced to death. That's when the Sunnis were out on the street trying to revenge for that decision. So the Iraqi government announced it 3 days curfew. Nobody goes out on the street, just so to spare the lives of some Iraqis not being killed in those 3 days. And on November 8th, the morning of November 8, 2006, on my sweet 16th birthday, we were heading from Iraq to Syria seeking refuge. And I still remember that morning when we left Iraq. It was a bit cold in the morning. The waves of many cars were all leaving Iraq towards Syria. And I believe it's very safe to say November of 2006 was the very peak of the civil war in Iraq. I remember the car right beside us that was full of women and a little child who kept every now and then just gaze at me from the window and would wave at me. So in the car, it was the driver driving, my father at the front, my brother right beside me. It was me, my little sister, my mom, and on her lap was my 6 months old sister. and we were heading all to Syria. Hundreds and hundreds of cars all heading towards Syria. As I'm sitting in the back seat in the middle, I have a clear vision of the street. And the car right in front of us, as we were hitting traffic, I saw 3 armed men got out of their cars and they came right back at our car. Just simply guns to my father's head, gun to my brother's head, and guns to the driver's head. Simple question, what is your last name? My father said our last name, and our last name could be either or, could be either Shia or Sunni. So the terrorist guy, call him a terrorist, he followed up asking a question to make sure our last name could be either or, but he wanted to know whether we were Shia or Sunni. So my father knew that we were hitting the area of Fallujah, which is dominated by Sunni, and they were revenging for Saddam's decision to sentence to death. And my father went on explaining to them that we were from a Sunni background, as my father was from a Sunni background, and they did not shoot. So they asked for our IDs. And my dad put all the IDs before we left with my mom. And he explained to her that if he said Sunni and they did not shoot, they investigated more and they did not shoot, then she had to hide her ID because her ID would identify as a Shia last name. And if they find this out, then the entire family would be murdered. So my father asked my mom to give out our IDs, and of course she hid hers. They looked at the IDs and they threw it back at us and they said, drive. They wanted to make sure we were Sunnis, so we were not the people to be killed today. The next car to us with that little boy, they asked him the same question. What is your last name? And apparently they were Shia. I remember them start shooting, but then I don't remember anything after that. I remember I opened my eyes and we were approaching Syria, the Syrian border. And that's when I opened my eyes and I thought I was dreaming. So I asked my mom and she said, we don't know. And I said, but they started shooting. She said, we don't know. We did not see them. And I think Iraqis would like to believe that theory of we don't know, we haven't seen, just because it's hard to face this reality. It's hard for many of them to just go as numbers. And I don't even know if they went as number and as statistics. So that was the journey on my sweet 16th birthday. By the end of the day, we made it to Syria. And I still remember that 16th birthday. We lived in Syria for 2 years. I was transitioning. I was being in a high school. I was living through the experience of a culture shock, as many of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who were living in Syria. And I finished my high school in Syria. And then as I was finishing my final exams in Syria, we received the news that we will be resettled to the United States in 2008. And that is when I was resettled in the United States in 2008. And in my head, a whole challenge and struggle started in the United States. First, I felt the entire time that I was forced out of my roots. I was taken out of my roots from Iraq to a journey that I did not want. I did not want to lose my friends. I did not want to lose my home. I did not want to be displaced. I don't want to be labeled as a refugee. I am not a refugee. I have a country that I want to go back to. I faced a lot of challenges here. I still remember one day when a guy who was recording me in his phone, and he just came in laughing and saying, "Hey, are you a terrorist?" And I just looked at him and I said, "What?" And he was like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Do you know how to make a bomb?" And in my head, I was thinking about all of the stereotypes that refugees have to face. I mean, refugees, they go through a very strict process in order for them to be able to be resettled into another country. They would have not become a refugee if they were just not fleeing conflict and war zones. And I resented this idea of accepting that this is the new reality for me. I resented the idea that I want to be in the US. All I thought it was like, this is temporary, and I'll go back to Iraq after I finish my degree. And this is not something permanent for me. I finished my my bachelor's, I finished my master's, and then during the time I was doing my master's, that's when Mosul was liberated from ISIS in 2017. And at that time, I was a mother. My little daughter was 3 years old. So I was looking at conflict from a different context. The way I was looking at conflict at the beginning was, I'm a child and I'm looking at the conflict from a child lens. But then I'm a mother and I have my own child, and I can just imagine as a parent how difficult it is for other parents around the world to protect their children from such war and atrocity. So as Mosul was being liberated, I was going through this crisis of how parents are going to sleep knowing that their children might die. That was just another whole another challenge for me to understand. That is when I decided that I want to go to Mosul, and I want to film a documentary, and I want to talk to people, and I want to hear them speak. So when I decided to go to Mosul, my husband was supposed to come with me to film, and I would just do the interviews. But on the last minute came that my husband's ID, Iraqi ID, was expired, so he wouldn't be able to go inside Mosul with me. So I had to go in by myself with my dad's friend. And before I went inside Mosul, I was trying to make sure that I got everything. I picked up the camera and I asked my husband, I said, "How do you turn this on?" And then I listened to myself saying this, and I said, well, I cried, and I'm like, what am I doing here? Do I really think I'll pull this off, just going inside Mosul, and I don't even know how to turn the camera on? And that's when my husband had the conversation with me, and he said, well, let's take a step back. Why do you want to go to Mosul? I said, because I want to hear people. I want them to talk to me, to tell me their stories, to feel that they're heard. I want the other side of the world to hear their stories. He said, why? And I reflected on his question of why. And I said, I think when I was little, during wartime, I wanted people to hear me. Because I thought and I felt that I was not heard. And I thought about how the world can just be silent about what is happening in Iraq. He said, then go. And I went inside Mosul, and what I saw in Mosul, the dead bodies were still under the rubbles. An entire city was down. It was reduced to rubbles. And children were out of school for years because of the curriculum that ISIS imposed, where they eliminated music, philosophy, art, and they implemented new curriculum such as physical preparation and jihad study. So many parents, they refrained from sending their children to school to study under ISIS. And that meant that some children were supposed to be in 3rd and 4th grade. They never attended school. So I went around in the city, I interviewed people, and I listened to their stories. People did not ask me for money or food. All they said was, listen to what I've been through. Go tell our story. And the amount of destruction I've seen there, I felt very hopeless. I was at an area, I sat on the rubbles of the mosque, of Al-Nuri Mosque, where ISIS leader gave his first sermon. I sat there and I was trying to just catch my breath to examine and check with myself because I was feeling so hopeless. That is when a little girl walked up to me with the hopeful eyes and she said, "Are you here to build us a school? Because I really want to attend a school." And I looked at her and, you know, in my head, I was saying, if this little girl can have hope, why can't I? She extended her hand for me to help me down from the rubble. And then I promised myself that I would tell their stories. So those were the children who have not attended a school in Mosul. And then I came back to the United States after I filmed and I interviewed people in Mosul. But when I came back to the US, I think I was depressed for a couple of months. I've seen the reality there. I had water poisoning for 2 weeks in Iraq because of the water in Mosul that I had. And I started wondering about what is home for me. I visited my home back in Iraq and it was not the same. We were not the same children who left Iraq, little siblings all living together with their parents. I was a mother. My brother and sister were married. I did not feel that I was home. So when I returned to the US, I was very, very in a deep depression. And I was asking myself, what is home? What is my identity? What can I do back in Iraq or in Mosul? Where do I start from? There were a mix of so many different feelings I did not know how to process at that time. But then I started to accept the reality of I can accept the US to be my second home and have also Iraq to be my first home. I can have a set of diverse identities. I'm an American, I'm an Iraqi, I'm a mother, I'm a student. And then I think my journey shifted from there. That is when I produced the long documentary about life under ISIS in Mosul. That is when I started to talk about my story as a refugee from Iraq. I started to talk about the consequences of these stories, like after the 2003 and the millions of stories of Iraqis that are scattered around the world. How do we process those feelings? And then since that time, since 2018, I started going back to Iraq almost every year, connecting back to my home culture, trying to understand me and process my feelings, and trying to be part of these conversations of what did we learn from the war in Iraq? What do we learn from these stories? How do we come together to have this conversation, not only about Iraq, but also about the many places today around the country that are considered as war zones? Talk about those lost childhood. And this is something we do not realize, that when we talk about stolen childhood, this is the time in our lives that we will never get back. These are the times when we are shaping our core memories and it will define who we are in our society. So if we are deprived from our basic rights to education, to food, to water, to clean water, our basic rights to just live in a happy family that has a mother and a father, parents, then what type of world are we creating for the next generation and for our children as well? So these are just a highlight of one Iraqi story. And the reason I think I did not share my story for 10 years from 2008 until 2018 is because I thought that my story didn't matter. I survived. I was able to survive. My dad wasn't killed. My brother was not tortured or killed in front of me. He did not lose a limb in front of me. Yes, my best friend was killed, but that's okay. Nothing really big to talk about. Because many other Iraqis, and it is safe to say millions of Iraqis had worse stories than I did. So there's nothing worth sharing. But I think we learn from those stories. We learn just by talking to each other and highlighting those times and events, whether it's in Iraq or any other parts around the world. So I would like to thank you so much, and thanks our audience for joining us today to listen to one of the Iraqi stories. And back to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Noor, for sharing that incredibly difficult story. And it's okay if we cry, just putting that out. I had to leave and go cry in the bathroom and put some makeup on again, because it's a dangerous message that you're sharing. And thank you for the courage to bring it here and put your heart on the table. And it's okay to cry. All right. For those of you watching, we'll start sharing your questions with Noor Ghazi in a few moments. Send your questions to feedback@pjw.info. Once again, feedback@pjw.info. If you want your name mentioned, please indicate that as part of your question. We do want to thank everyone who's watching tonight for your dedication to peace and solidarity with the people of Iraq. And while it might seem effortless, bringing this information to you isn't free. Peace and Justice Works relies on community members to support its work, organizing public events and more. In addition to demonstrations like the weekly Friday rally, the Iraq Affinity Group hosts speakers and forums, publishes fact sheets, and educates the public and elected officials about the effects of U.S. policy. That's our tax money. Peace and Justice Works' other projects include Portland Cop Watch, which is a crucial institution in our town of Portland, Oregon, focusing on police accountability work, and Flying Focus Video Collective, which has been producing video since 1991 and will present an edited version of tonight's event in the near future. We hope you will consider making a contribution and investment in Peace and Justice Works by sending checks or money orders to Peace and Justice Works, P.O. Box 42456, Portland, Oregon 97242, or donate through Network for Good by going to pjw.info/pjwdonate.html. Thanks for your support. I also want to remind you, you can join us on a Zoom call with Noor and the organizations at the after event starting at 6:30 or right after the Q&A period ends. Connect to that Zoom call at tinyurl.com Ghazi after. That's tinyurl.com GHAZIAFTER. There's also a call-in number for that Zoom call if you need to dial in instead of connecting by computer, or if that's how you do your Zoom audio. Okay, we're just about ready to start with the questions now, but before we do, I want to invite you to support local media by listening to KBOO.FM 90.7. You can listen to me, I'm Lisa Loving, on KBOO every Thursday morning at 8 a.m. on my live call-in show, Keeping It Real. That's at 90.7 FM and streaming online at KBOO/FM. So once again, if you have a question for Noor Ghazi, send it to feedback@pjw.info. I'm going to start by asking this first question. Are we ready? I have written a lot of questions, actually. But first, I wanted to ask, back in the early 2000s, it's okay if you, it's okay, I'm going to start crying again. There was a blogger named Riverbend. Her blog, these were the early days of blogs. It is a blogspot blog. Her blog was called Baghdad Burning. And she wrote this blog for several years. I'm looking at it right now. And when she stopped blogging, I wondered what happened to her. And she's writing about her family. She's writing about the personal relationships. She was writing, of course, about the policy. But Noor, the question I want to ask you is, why does it seem like when we focus on the policy, somehow we miss the real human impact of these issues? Am I being weird when I say that? You're talking about things that made you think. And yet, usually when I open up the New York Times, it's going to be how much money we spent. Like, why? Why is that? What's going on there? Why can't we talk about the people more?
Lisa, I think your question answers it, is that we dehumanize the conflict. And we tend to forget those real stories because they just become the real materials for war. And we forget to talk about real people. It seems like when we just talk politics, we talk numbers, we talk statistics, we talk money, we talk about the cost of war, but we don't talk about real people. And I think that is why it is very important to humanize those stories, because when we hear about conflicts, for example, today, the genocide that is happening in Gaza, we just talk about numbers. We say 30,000 people killed. All right, 40,000 people killed. The US sent X amount of money for aid. But can we zoom in to talk about 17,000 children who are going to live without parents? How does their story impact our world? How do we want to live in a peaceful world and call for peace if we have millions of people who are lacking the basic needs of education? I mean, if we just want to talk about the recent conflict, let's talk about the lack of basic human needs: water, food, safety. Those people are traumatized. How do we expect to humanize them if we don't talk about them? We don't talk about them. We just talk numbers and policies and politics. And I think it's very important. And I think that's why your group is also doing this job of shedding light on stories to humanize them and to say, hey, those people live amongst us in our societies today. So maybe if we take it from a personal perspective and try to listen, maybe we can humanize the conflict. Maybe some people who are going to listen to this story will, for the first time in their life, humanize the conflict in Iraq and the war of 2003. I do have conversations sometimes with people who served in the military in Iraq. Believe it or not, Lisa, I have one guy who came up to me and said, I have never thought about Iraq's conflict from the human perspective. It was always about the work and the great work of the US doing in Iraq. I never even thought the refugee crisis existed in Iraq after 2003. And I said, well, it's great to know that. It's great to know that there are many other people around the world. They don't see it the way we do.
I want to, we did get a question from the listeners, and it is a policy question. And I want to bring this question in and then weave it back into talking about the actual impact that these things are having with real people on the ground. But the question is, can you talk about the effects of depleted uranium on the people of Iraq? and they don't want their name read into the record. But I remember reading a lot about the depleted uranium. What is it doing? Is everybody okay?
So interesting enough that we don't have enough research. And I've had some conversations with some of the doctors in Iraq that they don't encourage this type of research in Iraq for some reason. But I know from doctors who would tell you that the records of cancers in Iraq, it's a skyrocket. It's at its peak currently. The birth defects also, not only in the north, in the south area in Iraq in Basra, but also in Fallujah. And they would tell you that there are, they're like the US used at least 800 tons of depleted uranium during the Gulf War and also during the 2003 war. On a personal level, I know so many people who were impacted by cancer. There is a great book that calls The Fall of Baghdad, and the author would tell you about his interviews to some of the people from the South who would tell the author that we know that this tomato is full of depleted uranium, but we have to eat it. We have no other choice. So people from these areas, they were heavily impacted by the depleted uranium. Children who were born with birth defects and a cancer. And I think Iraqis will suffer for many years to come from the depleted uranium. And the reason why is because this issue has not been taken seriously to put an action plan to act upon. So if we're not talking about it, it will continue to impact the Iraqi people in a very adverse way.
Because it got my attention when you had said, it became real when people saw it on TV. And you were talking about a specific situation, but it makes me wonder about a lot of situations. As I'm listening to you talk, I can't help thinking about this country, the United States, and how we think that our mythology and our whole creation myth that we are the greatest country, this and that, but we have a death rate in this country of handgun violence that's almost like a war zone. What can we do to support people in Iraq who are dealing with this impact of the depleted uranium? Like, do we have any influence over that? Can we in this country do anything?
This is a great question, Lisa. I think every solution starts with raising awareness, talking about the issue to really get people on board, to acknowledge that it is real. Now, I think maybe taking it from a different perspective, that we're not only talking about the impacts on the Iraqi people, we're talking about also the American military man who came back from this war and who has been impacted by the depleted uranium. Maybe if we bring in this conversation to the table and have it from a different perspective to say, hey, is not only impacting the Iraqi people, but let's look at our military man in the US and take it from this perspective, right? So if the US military man who served in Iraq for a short period of time, whether it's a year or two, who were impacted by this, how about Iraqis who are eating this food on a daily basis from those areas, who are living in those areas? There is a doctor, an Iraqi doctor named Al-Azzawi. He was talking about how children are just playing around those tanks and they're collecting the bullets and they're having them as souvenirs in their home. And he's just saying this is a disaster. If we don't have even education about it in Iraq to say, hey, you cannot do this, right? It is causing you cancer. So how do we anticipate finding a solution if we are considering this topic as a taboo and we're not touching on it? So I think we start with awareness and education and talking about it, bring it to the table as a real issue.
This is a tough question. We're still waiting for more people to send us a question for Noor Ghazi. And it's very rare that we have someone who has so much experiential knowledge here that we can all ask questions. Sometimes, and this is one of those moments, like I feel really struck by how ignorant I am as an American. And I feel like I've read books about this situation, but I mean, I feel like in our country, in the United States, we live in a bubble, and maybe that's a nationalistic bubble that exists in a lot of different places. But Noor, I wanted to ask you, you talked a little bit about a couple of turning points in your life in the presentation that you shared with us. What do you think was the most important turning point in your life that is actually bringing you back to Mosul every year? Do you go back every year? What was the real turning point?
Wow, this is a question, Lisa. Thank you for asking. I think so. The turning point, again, just because I was reflecting on my journey and I became a mother, that just gave me a whole different perspective of, I don't want this world for my daughter to grow up in. And how can I be part of a solution rather than a problem? I would not say I'm a victim. I don't like that. I don't want to victimize myself. I would say I am a survival and I'm a peace activist. And how can I work and do work in this world that will impact my daughter's journey and the millions of children around the world today that they're suffering at some different levels because of war and conflict. And I think that was the first turning point, being a mother. But then after that, just when I returned from Mosul after I went for the documentary, I think that was the very big highlight of my life. And the reason why is because I started to acknowledge my different pieces of identities and I started to embrace it. And instead of just in the past, when they asked me, where you from? I would say Iraq. I refused to say I'm an American. But then after that, I said, well, it's beautiful to say I'm an Iraqi-American. Why can't I say it? I don't see a weakness in that, but rather a strength, right? And then when I considered myself an Iraqi-American, I found myself immersed in two different worlds that I understand both. And when I returned from Iraq, I still remember driving back from Washington Airport to North Carolina. And all of a sudden, for the first time in the US after 10 years, I was seeing that the trees were very green. And I started to see that the streets are beautiful and the US is beautiful and the people are nice. And I can have a conversation and I'm part of this community and I can share my story. Just once I accepted this reality of I can be in two worlds. I can have two identities and I can create impact in both societies. And instead of just resenting this idea of me being in the US and wanting to prioritize one identity over the other. And I think this is also the way I'm raising my little kid today, that you can embrace both of your identities and you can say, I'm an American Iraqi and you can expose to both cultures. This is just a plus. You can speak both languages, and this is a plus, right? And I think many times we just fail to see the beauties in those different identities. And I think that was a turning point as I was driving back from Washington Airport to North Carolina. And I started to realize as I was starting to accept things in my life and starting to accept that I can call the US my home, because I started asking myself, what would I call home? A home is a place where I have my family, and my family were in the US. A home is a place where I can have the quality education, which I've been having it in the US and my little one as well. A home is a place where I can feel safe, and I feel safe to some extent in the US. I mean, with the topics of mass shootings that have been happening in some places around the US, this is also another place of trauma for me sometimes. But I started to embrace those feelings, and I think that was a very big turning point in my life.
All right. Curtis Bell wants to know, what do you see as the future for Iraq?
A lot of people ask me this question, and I would say always, I'm hopeful. I am hopeful in the next generation. in Iraq today, the level of awareness that they're having about the issues that are happening on the ground in Iraq today, I want to be optimistic. Many other Iraqis and Iraqi scholars would tell you otherwise. But I, for myself, in 2018, when I went to Mosul and I saw an entire city that was reduced to rubble, and then when I went back recently, and I've produced a short documentary that shed light on peace building in Mosul, I was very, very hopeful in this next generation that is really working so hard to coexist. Mosul was built off of the fabric of many ancient religions and civilizations, like the Christians, the Yazidis, the Muslim are the main fabrics of Mosul's social life. And today you see those youth and the younger generation are working so hard to coexist. To tell the Christian, just come back to the city, we will protect you. To tell the Yazidis that you're welcome in this community. So I am very, very hopeful. And as more people get involved into raising awareness and into building peace and giving back to Iraq, I think we're having a better future.
That's great. And now I have it's a really hard question from Barb Green. And it's a question that I've had about Gaza. Who's taking care of all the children that lost their parents? And how do you cope with trauma?
Yeah. This is a very, very hard question of who's going to take care of the children who have lost their parents. I'm not sure if there will be like a plan in place. And we know that children and women are the ones who are suffering during the war a lot. And I think when you're constantly on a survival mode where you're just trying to survive for the next day, trying to find water and food for the next day, you don't talk about trauma. That doesn't exist. I did not know that I was going through traumatic events until very later on in my life, when I was a mother, and I started to process those thoughts and feelings and started to say, oh my God, this thing triggers me, and why? We're talking about numbers, not only in Gaza. I mean, you look at Sudan today, you look at Ukraine, you look at so many different places around the world. And that's why I talk about those. And I mentioned that earlier, the lost childhood. This time in your childhood, when you lose, you cannot bring back. You're building your core memories off of those. So when you're having to lose parents, you're having to survive without parents. How's your future going to look like? When you're going to be deprived from your basic human rights, from your education, from school, how do we anticipate this next generation to look like? And those are people that we live with. So we're talking about our world. Those people can become part of our community. How? For me, and I think when we talk about lesson learned from Iraq, I would rather to talk about prevention rather than later on solutions. Because in our world, these solutions are just being lost in the talk of politics and numbers and money and militarizing wars and communities. So it's a very, very hard conversation because we don't even have, or I don't think we've even started to think about solutions for those children. Maybe we can start talking about how do we prevent supporting the genocides further to prevent more children from losing their parents. And then we present a solution on the table to say how the US can be part of the solution. And this is also some challenges that a lot of people find it hard to talk about. And I think A lot of Iraqis, for example, when they were accepted to be resettled to the United States, many of them resented this idea and they said, how do we go to the US, the country that invaded Iraq, right? So like you're talking about that same country. So I think, how do we push for prevention at the moment? And then we start talking about solution.
It's interesting, put in the context of the student protests in favor of a ceasefire. But I wanted to ask something that I think about all the time, and I mentioned it to you as we were talking before this event started. I'm doing a journalism training for reporters at different community radio stations around the country. And one of the questions that keeps coming up is, how do I interview someone who I find their opinions odious? How do I talk to someone who I think believes that my whole family should be dead or whatever? We're getting there. We are there in the United States. But I wanted to ask you, how do you talk to people when it seems impossible to talk to people?
Again, just going back to my first point of humanizing these points. However, sometimes people would just have a different opinion, you know, and then they would just not accept your opinion. I think I always keep it open. I had these difficult conversations with people in the past where they would push back, you know, would call me names. But I said that at the beginning. No matter how do we want to twist things around or label things around, people cannot just change the reality of what had happened, right? And I think if we just keep that in mind, there are facts out there that cannot be changed. Those numbers tell stories, right? The numbers today in Gaza, we cannot change this fact. We can tweak the truth and say names and label things around. We can call it whatever we want to call it, but we cannot erase those numbers. So I think, just in short, to say, to stay open to these conversations and to keep in mind, no matter how much people want to label things around, they cannot change the reality.
Right. All right. I'm not sure if we have more questions. I have more questions. I could talk with you all day. But I do want to ask one more question at the very least. For people who want to learn more about Iraq now and what's happening in regards to the larger war that seems to be breaking out with Israel, where should people go? Where should we be reading? What should we be watching to be really informed about what's happening in Iraq today?
Well, this is a very great question. And I think I use this method during my classes when I teach about Iraq. I think you can start by, and this is something just becomes very surprising for my students to say, we invaded Iraq for those reasons. Like, is that real? Or I'm like, I don't make up things. I'm teaching. So I cannot make up things, right? So I think just taking and reflecting back on the Iraq's war, we call it the Iraq's war, or the US invasion, or the liberation of Iraq. And just let's take a look at why the US invaded Iraq or went to war with Iraq or in Iraq. And then as we highlight those reasons and then we look at the outcome of that, these are facts. These are not opinions. And I think if we just start with facts, we can start to have a better understanding. And then again, after we get our facts together, we just try to humanize this conflict to see what were the outcomes of those conflicts. How did it impact the US? How did it impact Iraq? And after all, how did it impact the Middle East? And I think it opened the door wide open for terrorist groups to exist in the Middle East, and not only in Iraq, and later on the emergence of ISIS. And then did we really bring democracy to Iraq and the Middle East? Just let's ask ourselves those big questions that we entered Iraq under those labels and names. Did we find any ties between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda? Not to defend Saddam Hussein. Saddam's regime was one of the, I think, worst in history. But to highlight those points and to say, did we bring democracy and stability to the Iraqi people? Did we stabilize the Middle East, or did the opposite? What impact the Iraq war had on our the US military? for example, right? What are those numbers? How much we spent on war in Iraq and later on in Middle East? So if we just start with these questions and look at numbers, I think we can get down to the reality of the past 20 years.
All right. We don't have more questions. It is 6:26 p.m. in the beautiful city of Portland, Oregon. We're going to transition to our after party now. And I wanted to say a few things. Noor, what a treat. Thank you so much. This is hard stuff, but it's beautiful and it's really important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to our speaker and thanks to everyone who joined us tonight. Again, I want to remind you that as soon as we end the live stream, you can join us at the after event with Noor at tinyurl.com Ghazi after. We'll keep that up on the screen for a minute in case you need to jot it down. Meanwhile, we once again want to thank the co-sponsors tonight, along with Peace and Justice Works Iraq Affinity Group and its Ruth Holt Memorial Fund. We had support from Peace Action Group at First Unitarian, War Resisters League Portland, and Alliance for Democracy, and the endorsement of the Oregon Progressive Party. I hope you'll consider donating to Peace and Justice Works if you want to see more of these events. I'm just going to jump in here and say, very rarely do you have the opportunity to invest in such an impactful institution as Peace and Justice Works. That is a fact. That is not an opinion. I hope you'll consider donating to see more of these events, and also check the PJW website for listings of events. Call the office for information on meeting times. They really answer the phone. Noor, is there anything else you want to add before we end the live stream event and head to the after event?
I think as we're concluding this amazing conversation with you, Lisa, and our amazing audience, I think one thing as we are progressing with doing our work in this world is to ask ourselves, is this the world that we want our children to live in? What type of world that we envision for the next generation? And as we think about this question and contemplate on, let's keep in our minds the thousands of children that are today living around the world in conflict areas and war zone, and think about how they also want their stories to be heard, and what can we do? So I'll leave you with that question. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. And we hope to see some of you in a minute or so at the after event. Good night, everyone.